Welcome to The Critique. Today we're looking at a manuscript draft on North American indigenous history, focusing on the Cherokee and Navajo nations from Beringia to the present. Let's get right into it, starting with that opening section. A significant issue right at the start is the disconnection between the environmental data of Beringia and, the human migration narrative. The manuscript spends a lot of time detailing the mammoth steppe flora. We get species names like Erythranthe, Pinus, and it notes sea levels at 50 meters below current, but it never really connects those facts to how or why people, like the ancient Beringians, actually survived there.
I got that exact same feeling. It reads like a paleobotany textbook that just had a human history chapter accidentally glued onto it.
Right.
I think we need to reframe this whole refugium section. It can't just be a botanical list. It has to be the engine of human adaptation, the thing that sets the stage for everything that comes later.
The environment isn't just the wallpaper, it's the plot.
It is the plot. Exactly.
I agree, the data's all there, but the so what is totally missing. How do we make that more concrete for the writer?
Well, we have to look at it from the perspective of, survival mechanics.
Okay.
So instead of just listing the shrub tundra habitat, the writer should explain how the moisture gradient from the North Pacific created the specific wood fuel resources, birch, alder, spruce, that people needed to survive the last glacial maximum.
So it's not just that the plants were there, it's that these specific plants made life possible.
Yes. The source material even notes that Western Beringia was colder and drier, while the East was more diverse. That diversity isn't trivia. It's the pantry and the fuel depot.
I say.
If the manuscript explicitly links, say, the presence of spruce to the ability to build a fire and a shelter, then the refugium stops being this, waiting room.
And it becomes an incubator?
An incubator for adaptation, precisely. And building on that, we should also connect the isolation of the Beringian standstill, where the lineages diverged 20,000 years ago, directly to the Beringian gap hypothesis.
Okay, closing the loop.
Yeah. Show how that physical barrier of the ice sheets functioned in a similar way to the later cultural barriers that distinguish the Iroquoian-speaking Cherokee from their neighbors. It sets up a theme of isolation driving differentiation that can run through the whole piece.
That's a great structural point. Now moving south and forward in time, the manuscript. It hits some turbulence when it gets to the specific origins of the tribes.
It does.
The text really struggles to integrate the Great Lakes migration theory for the Cherokee with their linguistic roots and their oral traditions.
Right.
So right now, it just juxtaposes James Mooney's recordings about a Great Lakes migration against the Thomas White Appalachian origin theory, but without analyzing the tension between them. The reader is just left confused about the timeline of the Cherokee split from the northern Iroquoians.
It feels like the writer's trying to adjudicate a court case, Like one has to be right and the other wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
But what if the conflict itself is the narrative device? Instead of presenting them as competing factoids, use that linguistic split as a framework to discuss the unique cultural identity of the Cherokee, especially in comparison to the Navajo.
So don't say theory A is true. Say the existence of both theory A and theory B shows us something important about the people.
Exactly. Contrast the Cherokee's deep linguistic split, we're talking over 3,500 years, with the Navajo's much more recent arrival in the Southwest.
The Athapascan migration.
The Athapascan migration, which ends around 1400–1500 AD. By putting those timelines side by side, the conflicting Cherokee theories suddenly demonstrate how ancient their presence in the East really is, compared to the Navajo's rapid movement south. It anchors the Cherokee as a deeply established power.
Okay, that reframes it really effectively. And the manuscript does mention the oral traditions, the Navajo emergence legend, and the Cherokee story of Kitua.
Yes, but that section needs more weight. We could analyze the Navajo emergence legend, not just as a myth, but as a parallel to their 5-century trek.
Like a historical memory?
Exactly. A memory encoded in narrative. Compare that with the Cherokee tradition of Kitua as the mother town. One is a story of a long journey to a new land, an ascent. The other is a story of deep, rooted origin in that land.
I see. That's a much richer way to look at it. And what about the language itself? The manuscript touches on linguistic analysis, but it feels a bit academic.
It is. We can go deeper. Highlight the specific linguistic adaptation. The Cherokee word for policeman, dedanyaneski, or for clock,
Utanawatsky, shows this polysynthetic quality. Works.
Let's shift to the colonial contact period. This is where the manuscript falls into a very common, very restrictive trap. The section comparing Cherokee and Navajo responses to colonial pressure, it relies too heavily on a binary. It's the civilized tribe assimilating versus Navajo military resistance.
The classic trope.
It is. The draft portrays the Cherokee adoption of European farming as basically capitulation. If we look like them, they won't kill us. And the Navajo are just painted as raiders, which misses all the economic complexity.
It's way too reductive. The suggestion here is to complicate this narrative by focusing on strategic adaptation, not just assimilation or war.
Strategic adaptation. I like that.
Both tribes adopted specific technologies to preserve their sovereignty, not just to copy Europeans. It wasn't farming versus fighting. It was economic restructuring.
Okay, let's drill down into the Cherokee side of that. The manuscript brings up the Cherokee Triumvirate: James Vann, The Ridge, Charles R. Hicks.
Right, but it just lists them. We should frame them not as assimilators, but as economic strategists, as state builders. They use the white versus red organization of their society to centralize authority.
And the new technologies.
Exactly. Mention the printing press for the Cherokee Phoenix and the written constitution. These weren't just attempts to look white. They were tools of legal warfare. They were building a state apparatus to fight another state apparatus.
That's a proactive strategy.
A very aggressive one.
And on the flip side, the Navajo section is almost entirely about raiding.
And that's just as misleading. We need to highlight that their raiding was an economic redistribution system. It was built on Spanish horses and sheep.
It became a pastoral economy.
A whole economy. And more than that, the manuscript should point out that the Navajo learned silversmithing from a Mexican smith named Herrera. This wasn't just raiding, it was industrial espionage and economic shifting. They were acquiring a trade.
So just as the Cherokee adopted cotton plantations,
The Navajo adopted silver and sheep. Both were strategic economic pivots.
moving into the mid-19th century, we get to removal. And the pacing here is a real problem.
A huge problem.
The narrative just accelerates way too quickly when discussing the Trail of Tears and the Long Walk. It treats them as basically identical events of displacement. It lumps the Cherokee Trail of Tears and the Navajo Long Walk together as generic removals. And that ignores the very distinct political contexts: the judicial fight of the Cherokee versus the scorched earth military campaign against the Navajo.
It blurs them. And if we blur them, we lose the specific tragedy of each. We need to distinguish the mechanics of these removals to highlight the different failures of U.S. government policy.
One was a failure of law, the other was a failure of morality through military action.
Exactly. The Cherokee removal was a failure of the executive branch to uphold the judicial branch. The Navajo removal was a straight-up military operation.
So we need to see the courtrooms for the Cherokee and the canyons for the Navajo.
That's it. Contrast the Cherokee's Worcester v. Georgia legal victory, which Jackson famously ignored, with the Navajo's military defeat at the hands of Kit Carson and Kenyon D. Shelley.
The scorched earth policy.
He was destroying their orchards and cornfields to starve them out. That is a fundamentally different experience.
And the draft also kind of treats the tribes as monolithic victims here. It glosses over the internal divisions.
And that's such a fascinating layer that's missing. We have to highlight those divisions. For the Cherokee, you have the Ridge Party versus the Ross Party, which leads to assassinations. It's a civil war within the removal itself.
Right.
Then you compare that to the Navajo, who were, yes, a beaten people at Fort Sumner, but that shared trauma led to a kind of unification, and eventually the Treaty of 1868.
Which led to their return home. And that seems like the most critical distinction.
It is. The Cherokee didn't go back. They had to rebuild in Oklahoma. The Navajo returned to their original homeland. And we can't forget the old settlers for the Cherokee.
The ones who moved before the forced removal?
Yes, the Western Cherokee. The manuscript is missing that whole dynamic, the tension between those who left early and those who were forced out later. Sequoyah was there mediating between them. That's a rich part of the story.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's talk about the conclusion. The draft brings us to the modern era, but it feels a bit sterile.
It does.
It lists modern population numbers
economic activities, but it fails to connect any of it back to the concept of tribal sovereignty that was so central to the earlier historical sections.
Right.
Listing the Cherokee Nation's business revenue or the Navajo's oil and gas leases, it reads like a corporate report. It's disconnected from the struggle for land jurisdiction.
It feels like a list of assets, not a continuation of history. I think the fix is to reframe all that modern economic data as the direct result of the legal and territorial battles they fought.
So the money is the output, but sovereignty is the engine.
Sovereignty is the engine. You can't have the oil leases without the land title.
Okay, give me a concrete example of how to tie that thread together.
Connect the Navajo's 16 million acre reservation and their timber industry directly to that Treaty of 1868. Because they returned home, they retained a massive contiguous land base.
Which allowed for large-scale industry.
Yes, and contrast that with the Cherokee, who had to rebuild from scratch in Oklahoma and deal with allotment policies that broke up their land base. Their economic engines look different because their land histories are different.
And what about the legal battles? The draft mentions the Freedmen controversy, but it's sort of an aside.
It needs to be central to this discussion of sovereignty. The Freedmen controversy in the Cherokee Nation is a direct legacy of the Treaty of 1866. It's a debate about the fundamental right of a nation to define its own citizenship.
And for the governance structures.
We should contrast the All-Navajo Council dealing with uranium and the legacy of the Code Talkers with the Cherokees' specific modern struggle with the McGirt v. Oklahoma Supreme Court decision.
A huge decision about criminal jurisdiction.
But it's about more than that. It's about the affirmation of the reservation boundaries themselves. Connecting modern court cases like McGirt back to the 19th century treaties. That closes the circle of the whole narrative. It shows that the history part of this manuscript isn't actually over.
This has been very productive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the Ice Age all the way to the Supreme Court.
We have.
Okay, to recap the main points for the rewrite. First, bridge the geological and human gap in the Beringia section. Reframe that refugium as an engine of adaptation.
Right.
Second, treat the conflicting origin theories not as a mystery to be solved, but as complementary frameworks that highlight cultural distinctiveness. Third, complicate that assimilation narrative. Frame it as strategic adaptation and economic restructuring. Fourth, distinguish the mechanics of the Trail of Tears from the Long Walk. Honor their specific contexts and internal politics.
And the outcomes.
And finally, ground all the modern economic statistics in the deep history of legal sovereignty.
That's it.
We invite you to revise the manuscript with these lenses in mind and submit the next draft for review. We look forward to seeing how these adjustments strengthen the work.